At long last, we are taking a look at the 1964 epic war film, Zulu. And I actually have a lot to say about this movie, so hopefully this will be one of the more interesting reactionary reviews. So, Zulu takes place during the 1879 Anglo-Zulu War and portrays the Battle of Rorke's Drift and the aftermath of the previous Battle of Issaldawana. At this point in time, the British were rapidly expanding across Africa, particularly in South Africa, and they came up against the Zulu Kingdom, which is one of the few African states that was adequately organized and was able to field a large, well trained, disciplined army that actually gave the British some trouble. It wasn't necessarily just fighting a bunch of just random guys in the jungle anymore. They were fighting people who had real tactics, real organization, and were overrunning large portions of the region. Now, a film like this could never be made today because it portrays Zulus in a fairly historically accurate fashion. It also portrays white people killing black people and not making the white people look completely evil. In other words, it attempts to accurately display historical events, which is something that we just cannot tolerate in this day and age. I guess kind of the first question we have to ask ourselves is this a raw pro colonial movie? Is this saying the British Empire was awesome? There's a part in it where the surgeon's talking about how they're a bunch of butchers and he's tired of constant warfare, which is kind of a criticism, I suppose you could say. The impression I get from this, and there's some other movies like this, like San Pablo, where you're like, why are these British guys in this random ass part of the world? Why are they in South Africa? Why is there a Welsh regiment there? Like, it's just random, it's unnecessary, it's a waste of time and money, and it's just causing a bunch of unnecessary deaths. Because keep in mind, there's a lot of conservatives who are against the British Empire, or at least parts of it, because they're like, it doesn't benefit the British people in any way to conquer these random ass parts of the world that don't really even have many natural resources. And then we have to pay to administer it, and we have to pay for garrisons, and we have to send our young men overseas to get malaria. And that's the reason, like, Bismarck, for instance, held out so long in getting colonies, was he didn't really get why they were a benefit to Germany. And when they grabbed them, it was like solely as a prestige thing rather than any sort of economic motivation. So you do kind of get like a bit of the absurdity of this thing is you have this random Welsh regiment in the middle of South Africa trying to bridge some river no one's ever heard of. So is it really raw imperialism, or is it kind of a dry commentary on how ridiculous things got during this time period? I think you can take it either way. I think a good thing about this movie is it's not very ham-fisted with its messaging, and you can kind of take away whatever you want. I don't think this movie is trying to be political. I think it's mostly about the Warriors Code. And maybe just I'll talk about that a bit as an introductory thing. I remember when I was reading Mark Stein's book America Alone, and he was talking about the Christmas truce and why it was so significant. That's during World War One. On Christmas Day, everyone stopped fighting, and the soldiers went out and traded with each other, and the Germans and British hung out. It was more or less a tribute to our common humanity. That at the end of the day, once all the politicians are done making us fight these brutal wars, people are just ultimately people. In that there's a certain kinship, there's a certain warrior's code between all fighting men, regardless of their cultural context and their era. And I think it's more about that than anything else, a struggle of wills between these two groups of men, and them ultimately coming to respect one another and having a moment at the end where it's like, the, I'm not even mad, bro. And that's more what I think it's about than anything particularly racial or political. It's about the British coming up against a worthy adversary for the first time in a long time and having to actually struggle against it. And the two sides, despite being completely from different cultures, races, locations, religions, are able to find that common humanity and that common respect for one another. It reminds me a little bit of Passive Glory. And the thing that's nice about Passive Glory is it's not in any way a political movie. It's just about the difficulties and absurdities that come with being a soldier and serving in war. I think this movie actually does a good job of portraying a lot of aspects of war. And some people might say it's a little long and maybe slow in parts. But that's what the experience of a soldier is most of the time. Most of the time, you're literally just sitting around gambling, eating hardtack, doing boring chores, and waiting for something to happen. It's like 95% boredom, 5% sheer terror. And things don't work like they do in, ironically enough, the movies. It's not always this like choreographed, edited thing where it's always fighting constantly. There's lulls in the fighting. There's people who aren't engaged. There's people who are going from place to place. Like throughout this movie, during some of the battle scenes, they seem to just be going pretty slow. Like people are just kind of fighting. There's not any particular, like I said, choreography to it. It's not like one dude's just going in and takes out like five guys. They're like wrestling with each other. They're shooting each other close range, and like the battles actually take a long time, and you get the impression of both sides just kind of getting worn down. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that there's a lot of focus in this movie in trying to actually portray what a battle would look like. At least to my understanding, having read history books. Once again, I've never served in the army, but this seems a lot more accurate than a lot of modern war movies. So maybe just to get back to the battle a bit. So prior to this, at the Battle of Iseldawana, if I'm pronouncing that properly, about 20,000 Zulus went up against 1,200 British soldiers, and the Zulus actually managed to win the battle and completely destroyed the British column. They were able to take large amounts of weaponry and ammunition from it, and they continued forward to the missionary station at Rorke's Drift. The commander in charge decided that there was really no way that they could escape. Some people had suggested running away, and some people, I think, misinterpret the movie as saying, at least in my opinion, that they're too prideful to run away, and it's the whole stiff upper lip thing. I think the commander correctly realized that the Zulus could run for like 50 kilometers a day, and there was no way that they were going to be able to get away in time. So it was better to just defend the fortified position where they had large stores of food, water, and ammunition, than trying to go out to the middle of nowhere just so that they could get ambushed and surrounded. There's kind of an interesting contrast here between the commanding lieutenant and the other lieutenant played by Michael Caine. Michael Caine's character is just this arrogant, pontish, upper class guy who just has complete disdain for the Zulus. He's just like, they're a bunch of savages. They don't know what they're doing. We don't even have to worry about them. He's like, I'm just going to go out with like 30 guys and we're going to beat the 4,000 Zulus in single combat or something. And the main lieutenant's like, dude, you're just stupid. We have to take this threat seriously. So very quickly, he just orders everybody to build fortifications. So they use wagons, they use sandbags, bags of corn and other grains, and they build like a it almost looks like an early trench around the location. They make the walls up to 9 feet high in places with steps behind them, so they're able to shoot at the Zulus, and the Zulus have to try to climb over this fortification to get at them. He realizes correctly that their big advantage is their firepower, and they have to try to maximize that without, well, minimizing what the Zulus have. He does a lot of other things like arming the sick men, placing ammunition at strategic points. The commander is just very competent in general. And it's always nice in these films to see like two competent military commanders, him and the Zulu general, just going up against each other and trying to outsmart each other. It kind of reminds me of something like Balance of Terror, where the movie was that the Star Trek episode was so good because both Kirk and the Romulan commander were competent and they were worthy adversaries for each other, and they were able to keep one-upping each other, and it's nice to see a clash between equals. And I think that's, once again, I mentioned this earlier, something that is unique about this movie is the Zulus are very much portrayed as being the equals of the British. Sure, they don't have the same uniforms and weaponry and line formation, but they're disciplined soldiers who are able to use formations, who are brave enough to charge fortified positions, who try to do things like flanking, attacking from multiple angles. There's a part where the Zulus go up on the hills next to Rorke's Drift and start firing with their captured guns as they attack from the front. The Zulu realize that part of the advantage of their numbers is they can constantly attack in waves and prevent the British from getting any sleep. So they'll get worn down. And that's kind of something I think interesting about this is a lot of people once, as I said at the beginning, will think this movie is racist because it's white people killing black people. Oh, the Africans look like savages. They're wearing loincloths. They're like half naked. I mean, that's probably just because it's really hot in South Africa. So it probably is preferable to not wear the wool uniforms. I'd imagine the British would a lot of them would pass out from heat stroke. Like, oh, well, they're using shields and spears against guns. Well, they don't have guns. They use the guns that they have access to, but they just don't have the ability to make guns. I'm sure if the Zulus had enough guns to equip their army, they'd equip their army with guns. Also, it's just their strategy is based on like overwhelming force, envelopment, ambushing, stuff like that. So it could be very true that in a lot of cases, the use of like mass conscription to raise a huge army and equip them with spears might be more effective than having a relatively small number of soldiers with firearms. But it's like one of the things I find whenever you look at something like this is they'll say, "Oh, it plays into Orientalist stereotypes." It's the other. It's the British are viewing them as these savages, as this foreign thing. And I mean, that's obviously true. I mean, but I'm sure the British are also that way to the Zulus. This is something I find ironic about a lot of the post-colonial narrative is it's from a purely European perspective. It's like from a white self-hating perspective. It doesn't really attempt to look at any of the cultural context of the other side. Like I had to do a course on indigenous issues at my work. We talked 0% about indigenous culture, indigenous ways of knowing, history. It was just entirely about how they're victims, how they just lost to white people. It's just kind of like we're losers and that's our identity. Maybe that's mean of me to say, but that's basically what it comes down to. And even in this context, it is kind of demeaning actually because it's like, oh, well, this portrayal of them the way they are is like racist and bad. But it's like, let's think about this logically for a minute. Which makes black people look better? Another whiny slave movie where the guy gets beat up and like white people like destroy their culture or whatever, or a bunch of Zulu chads stabbing British soldiers with spears and running into guns. I mean, this makes them look cool. This makes them look like chads. Also, something I think people forget about, and I've done videos on this, a lot of the Orientalist stuff is deliberate. I mean, Chinese emperors and a lot of Eastern kings, they have the elaborate stuff, they have the court, the excess and stuff like that because it intimidates people. Because their subjects look at it and they go, "This dude isn't like us. He's a god. He's some sort of divine figure. He doesn't act or look like a common man." And you see that also in Europe with kings. There's all kind of rituals surrounding them, things to try to separate them from the rest of the population. You even have stuff like special uniforms, like the Beefeater uniforms. Special operations often will have them. They'll have other kind of weird things about them to give them a certain mystique. And why would that be any different? I mean, if the British have these Orientalist stereotypes and they're afraid of savage peoples, then wouldn't it make sense for the Zulu to kind of go with that? Like, what's more scary? Just a bunch of like Zulus with, I don't know, just running, marching calmly at them, or screaming like weird war cries in their own language, hitting their shields together, like with like teeth and all this other stuff, bones on them, looking like they've come from the gates of hell themselves. And this is hardly unique to this time period. I mean, you have the whole US shock and awe, where if you just make it impressive enough, just blow stuff up, show off the big guns, then your enemy's just going to get demoralized and run away. It's the same thing like with the Mongols. Like, the Mongols did really brutal stuff, but the purpose of it in part was if you destroyed a city, and killed everybody in it. And then you go to the next city and you're like, okay, you can surrender and pay us tribute, or we're going to kill everybody. You have that precedent established. People are fucking afraid of you, and they're going to surrender, or they're going to break and run. And I don't really get why trying to prey on British fears to demoralize them and maybe get them to break is necessarily like a racist thing. Also, you're kind of judging them based on Western standards. It's like, oh, they're not wearing European uniforms. They're not using European tactics. That automatically makes them bad. That automatically makes them losers. It is, I think, very demeaning. And like I said, in this movie, the Zulus aren't just like some random, like guys they're just shooting. They are a disciplined army that can run like 50 kilometers a day, that fights in formation, that will attack fortified positions. And they have stuff like the discipline to have your men retreat in the middle of a battle is really challenging. Um, to maintain any sort of order and discipline in that situation is really tough. But one of the kind of the ongoing things in the film is, like I said, the British start off, a lot of them, other than the Boer and the Swiss guy, are like, oh, they're just a bunch of savages. They don't know what they're doing. They're not going to give us any challenge. But very quickly, the Zulus start to give them a run for their money. And they're killing a lot of Zulus, but the Zulus are giving as hard as they get. They're getting in close. They're fighting with their spears. They have the guys sniping from the mountainside. They start burning some of the stuff. Well, the Zulus don't burn it down. They the people firing from the inside with guns light the thatched roof on fire. And we of course get to like one of the greatest scenes in cinema where the Zulus start singing in order to kind of intimidate them and scare them. And once again, people are like, "Oh, it's Orientalists that they're like black people and they like music because that's a bad thing." It's like it's always weird with these stereotypes that are like I don't really get. Like it's like, "Oh, it's racist if you associate black people with fried chicken." Yeah, but fried chicken's awesome. Everybody loves fried chicken. Who cares? Like if you're British, you complain about being associated with meat pies. Meat pies are awesome. Why wouldn't you want to be associated with meat pies? Like, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with like beans and cornbread and stuff like that? I don't know. I just like all that food. So like, it's like okay, so they're singing this like badass song. How is that like racist? How is that making them look bad? It makes them look like a bunch of chads. And then the British kind of are like, you know what? We're gonna have a bro off here. We're gonna see who the bigger chads are. So they're a Welsh regiment. So they start singing "Men of Harlech," which is a song from I think it was a siege that took place during the English conquest of Wales. And then they kind of have the final fight, and the Zulus eventually give up. And at the end of the movie, we have the Zulus show up for a final time, and they think that they're dead and that this is the final attack. But the Zulus salute them, acknowledge their mutual respect. And like I was watching the movie, I just said, I'm not even mad, bro. We just had a chat off. You beat us. But at the end of the day, we're both warriors. We have mutual respect for each other. Ultimately, as different as we are, as hostile as we are to one another, there is this common humanity in us. There is this warrior code. There is this sense of common respect. And I'll have to give it to this movie. Like, does it portray supposed Orientalist stereotypes? I guess, but that's just attempting to portray things like as they happened. And if you feel like if you identify with the British soldiers and you're scared that this like giant group of savage people are surrounding you, I mean that's kind of the point. Like scaring your enemy, freaking them out, making them disorganized, making them not hurting their morale, making them break and run away is a key part of warfare. I mean, Sun Tzu talks about stuff like this all the time. But like once again, what makes black people look better? Something like this, where they're throwing down with the British, they're given as good as they got. Um, there's mutual respect, or another whiny movie about slavery where it's like, oh, we were abused. Um, we have no agency. White people just completely blew us out, and we didn't do anything about it. We aren't going to actually talk about our culture or history or anything like that. We're just going to focus on white people and how bad they are. And I kind of wish there was more movies like this. Like, once again, ironically enough, you couldn't make something like this today. Even though, in my opinion, I think it makes the Zulus look way better, or I guess you could just say Africans look way better than any of the shitty, like, Civil War slavery movies that we've seen, or any of these whiny civil rights era movies. I'll kind of leave you off. The Hungarians, obviously, their real name is for themselves, it's the Magyars, but they got the name Hungarians because people associated with them the Huns. And to my understanding, the Hungarians were like based. They're like, okay, we're gonna get associated with like these with the scourge of God, with this savage people who scared literally everybody in Europe. That's fucking awesome. We're just gonna go with that. Like, if you were associated with Attila the Hun and people thought you were as vicious and tough as him, wouldn't you go with that? Wouldn't you think that that was awesome? And that's what this film does. So overall, I just think it's a really solid movie. I think it portrays warfare in a, at least in a kind of a more interesting, accurate, slow way. And it is, like I said, a testament to the warrior's code and to common humanity. And that at the end of the day, once all the politicians are done throwing us into wars against each other, people are ultimately just people. And I don't think that's a bad message per se. That it's nice to see a movie where black people have agency, where black people actually like put up a fight and aren't just victims. So hope you enjoyed the review. It was fun watching this movie again. More exciting reviews to come in the future. God bless everybody, and I'll talk to you again real soon.